Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to Registries Revealed, the show where we dive into a different country's company registry system each episode. If you're working in financial crime, fraud or investigations and need to know more about company registers, then this is the show for you. Today's country has 10 sheep for every one person, the most southerly capital in the world, and also the town with the longest name in the world. If you can pronounce it, I tip my hat to you because I'm not even going to attempt it. If you haven't clocked already, we're talking about New Zealand, and we've got a real treat of a guest for you today as well. Justin Hygate was formerly the general manager of the New Zealand Companies Office and spent an impressive 26 years working for the registry, playing a huge role in developing its international reputation for innovative service delivery. He's since joined Foster Moore as Vice President of Registry Solutions and remains a self-confessed registry geek who's active in registry transformation projects across the world. Justin was the driving force behind the creation of the Corporate Registrars Forum in 2003 and has also served on the board of the International Association of Commercial Administrators. Over the course of the show, we delve into all of our usual themes: transparency versus privacy, the role of registry as service provider, and whether registries should undertake any kind of triage or verification of the data they hold. On the last point, Justin's got some really interesting insights, so definitely stick around for that. I'll be back in around half an hour, but for now, let's get into it. So Justin, welcome to the show. We've had some different types of guests on the podcast over our first few episodes. We've had a few people working with the registry. We've had someone who's reporting on a registry. You're the first person we've had that's actually worked for the registry we're here to talk about, and for 26 years at that. So tell us, how did you first get involved with working with the New Zealand Companies Office?
Well, kia ora, Steve, and thank you for the opportunity to chat. I started, in fact, 21st of January 2025 will mark 40 years, despite my youthful appearance, for 40 years of working in registries. I joined the Companies Office in Christchurch, New Zealand, back in 1985. And I worked in the search room, actually. So in those days, we had 12 companies registries, or 12 offices for the registry in New Zealand with physical files. And my first job was to retrieve the files from the filing system and pass them to the law clerks who would do the then company search. And from there, I worked my way through the public service. And when I left, was the group manager looking after the registries for New Zealand, which were very different from the ones that I joined when I left.
I was going to say, you must have seen a lot of change in that time.
Yeah.
What, through digitization of records, moving everything online?
Yeah, in fact, the big change, everything you can imagine, actually. So the biggest changes were a modernisation of the Companies Act. So when I joined, we had the Companies Act 1955, which was, interestingly, as many jurisdictions, particularly common law jurisdictions were at the time, the Companies Act were very much written for publicly listed companies. It was assumed that companies would be these big multi-shareholder things, and so the Companies Acts themselves were huge. And New Zealand took quite a revolutionary position back in the day and introduced the Companies Act in 1993, which was focused on small to medium or closely held companies. Because as is true in every jurisdiction, the vast number of companies on a register are small companies, small, closely held, and it's the exceptions that are the publicly listed. And so they turned the Companies Act on its head. And it was so successful, in fact, that it was adopted and picked up by lots of countries around the world, which is part of my own story because, of course, then I worked for an IT company and we followed those Companies Acts around the world and dropped in companies registry systems. But that's another story. So, yeah, we did that. Obviously, when I joined, we had 12 offices. We had physical files. We had quite a lot of old school stuff. We didn't have a lot of tech, actually. We used a central registry for names. We used microfiche for company searching and indexing. And I was lucky enough to have joined it at a time when we digitized. So we moved on to Wang computer systems for the historians out there. Did a project where we digitized all of the company records and put them onto a Wang VS system. And it was actually a very serendipitous event when Wang went into bankruptcy because it allowed us to port onto Oracle technology. And why that's important is it meant that we were the first companies registry in the world to allow you to search for a company over the internet, something people take for granted today, but in 1996 was pretty revolutionary. And in 1998, we allowed you to form a company over the internet. So the New Zealand experience of digitization is pretty, to put that in context, we were talking about Microsoft Golf on CD-ROMs and 286 computers. And law firms did not have computers. We would be suggesting to law firms that they might want to get a PC so that they could connect to this thing called the internet and save their staff time and actually do a company search, over the internet. And from there, it kind of snowballed. And I think you'll find this when you talk to a lot of people in the registry world. Where registries do well, such as the New Zealand Companies Office back in the day, government give them more registries. So they become centres of excellence, as is the case in New Zealand, for registry activity. So they start with one, do it well, and they give them more.
Yeah, and talking about the registry being online and your role in that, and I know it was the world's first fully electronic company register as well, which is worth saying. New Zealand's always had a reputation as a place that's relatively easy to do business. Do you think that's played a role?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's lots of factors. I'm sure when I'm old and retired, I'll sit and write a book, which no one will read. But I often reflect on what the big differences are, because I've been in this game, as I said, for quite a long time, and I've had the privilege in that time of visiting about 70 or so registers globally. So both in my role in government, working with the World Bank, I did some consulting with them, and in my current role, I've physically visited registries, 70 or more of them. And it's really interesting. You can break them into two sorts at very high level. Those that are business focused, that are there that see their role as being the enabler of business, the birthplace, they create the company record, and they work with entrepreneurs and others to make it easy to navigate, the rules. And the others that have a much more punitive, regulatory structured, we make it very hard for you to form. But once you're formed, we've checked and we've crossed T's and dotted I's and done a lot of work at the front there. And so the New Zealand approach was much more working alongside the entrepreneur. Yeah. So the company's registry benchmarks itself against other service providers to business. So they want to, they see themselves as, yes, a regulator, but they want to make it easy for the entrepreneur to start. And in fact, they sit, and it's not uncommon in these customer-focused registries, they sit alongside the intellectual property office or the trademark office, and all of these in New Zealand, they sit alongside the New Zealand Business Number Register and some others that are all there looking to help business start, grow, get the support it needs, the government programs that are available, et cetera, et cetera. So that was very much the ethos of the organizations that, the organization then and the organization now.
I think that really shows as well, even today when you're looking at the website. I mean, it's a simple thing to look at how the website operates and how it feels, but everything's very clearly laid out. Extensive help guides to those that are registering businesses, easy to get the information you need. We'll talk more about the AML role and how easy it is to verify businesses. But, it looks to me that almost no matter what the task is, if you're engaging with the register, there's, some thought has been given to what the quote unquote customer experience looks like.
Well, I'm glad you found that, because again, from a really nerdy point of view, and I am a self-confessed registry geek, one of the search rules or guidelines that we came up with, and is still there today, is that it shouldn't be difficult to find a company, and companies change their names. But if you go to the New Zealand Companies Registry and you put in the old name of a company, you will find the record under its new name, and it'll show you clearly, Justin Hygate Limited is now Bob Smith Limited. But it'll still find that very quickly, make it clear. Now, that might sound simple, but the idea behind it is it should be easy to find a company. It shouldn't be a challenge. You shouldn't have to have some, expertise in the law to know whether this company is on the register or not. So it's those sorts of things that people applied a bit of thought to and tested, and they've proven to be very successful.
Yeah, I think there's a number of dimensions you can assess a registry, and it depends again on what your purpose is for accessing it. But certainly, a couple that have come up in our conversations so far on this series have been the level of transparency, so what data is available, And also part of that transparency question is how can you access it? And particularly, do you have to pay to access the services? And I think, depending on your point of view, I would say New Zealand scores highly on both of those things. So very transparent in terms of the data that's made available there. And also it's all free. So you can go on there, you can access details about a company, you can see their previous filings, and you're not charged the sums you are at other registries. So comparing it to some of the registries we've looked at so far, it would be natural to compare it to something like Companies House in the UK, which has also got a relatively easy to access, easy to navigate website and free services on that. But I think actually what's interesting, and coming back to that names point, is when you dig into some of the details, there are some quite unique elements, which, even if we think particularly about the AML challenge and how you verify a business and make your life much easier. So refamiliarizing myself with the Companies Office before this call, even one thing that stood out to me was the fact that you can see trading names, and those are listed alongside the registered name because, often if you're onboarding a business and particularly if it's a kind of relatively low touch onboarding process, you might have a customer applying for an account with their trading name, and you've then got to try and reconcile that with a business registration. So to actually have that information, as part of that single view, clearly really useful for that.
Yeah, and it's going to get better actually in that. So one of the things that's unique about the operating environment in New Zealand, with the exception of maybe of the UK, we don't have a business names register. So Australia, for example, has a register of business names, and I can rock on up. And business names typically are, it would be fair to say they are more often than not sole traders that are that put a shingle up outside and say, I'm, Pete's Fish and Chip Shop. Because I've got to say fish and chips because I'm a Kiwi, and people watching the podcast will go, what did he just say? So Pete's Fish and Chip Shop is owned as a business that I might interact with, but it's a sole trader. And how do I know who it is? So if there's an event, and I need to get to the owner, we don't have a business names register, but we do have the New Zealand business number register, the NZBN number. And in fact, our current government have announced improvements and enhancements to that register, and it's going to be mandatory for people to disclose the people behind a business number in a name. So it's effectively it's a business names register coming along without a requirement for that name component. So what we did, and you'll see there's a lot of things that happen in the companies register here, where we're trying to validate data points and make it easy for people to in the same way as to make it easy to find the company, to make it obvious where we have validated a secondary source of information. So things like an address. So when you do a company search, you'll see for an address, whether that address has been validated against a postal address file. So is the address a real address in New Zealand that the New Zealand Post Service will deliver mail to? And you've got a green tick visually, so the person doing the search can see that that's a valid address. So the trading name is a voluntary requirement, it's not a mandatory requirement, but it allows the company to disclose that information for free on the register. There were two drivers for it. One was the data point. The other was actually to recognise that there is a burden on business to go to the company's registry once a year and to file their annual return. So how do we make that a more logical, where do we provide value for the business owner? And that was one way to do it, that they could give a contact number. They could give they used to be able to give a website address to drive traffic to their web.
Yeah, and I guess there is a network effect to that in a way, which is that the easier you make it for people to contribute information at the start, the less information in theory that needs to be collected or re-verified at various parts in their life cycle as a business, such as when they're applying for a bank account. Therefore, they're going to get access to those services quicker and have to go through less verification. So it's an interesting approach to, almost open up the kind of the full field of information that the company can submit, albeit, on a voluntary basis.
Yes. Yeah. I think one of the other things that we've spoken about previously is that one of the differences in New Zealand is we don't have the financial account information, unlike Companies House, where you can get the accounts for pretty much all companies. In New Zealand, our requirements are less. So it's only publicly listed companies that are held, within 25% of the shares held overseas, subsidiaries of overseas companies, etc. There's criteria that's determined which companies are required to disclose their financial accounts, and so the vast majority of closely held companies don't. But all the other information that we have allows you to identify that this is a real company, identify who the directors are, who the shareholders of that company are. We'll talk about beneficial ownership and what's coming, I think, later on. So what we do provide is, as you say, is all available, all easy to search, and the aim was always that it could be ubiquitous. So because it's free, and because we provide very rich API services, the company's registry provide these very rich API services, which are also free and are self-help. You can download them and sort them out yourselves. The idea is that you could integrate those into business processes, such as your own organization, so that you can consume those and do clever things with them.
Yeah, it goes back to what we were saying previously, that there seems to be a level of thought that has consistently gone in as to who the user is of the registry. And, I guess we are, or certainly I am, biased in some way, that I'm coming in with a certain view, with a cohort of customers in our case who are using the registry for one purpose, which is verifying businesses. But actually, it sometimes seems when you look at these registries, like almost they are the one customer set they're looking at is the businesses themselves that are registering. Well, it's probably not good to focus on one at the behest of the other. You've got to focus on all of those different populations that are using your register and think about what their specific use cases are. And, when you talk about things like that, I'm really keen to come actually back onto the point about address validation. It definitely, again, seems like there's that level of thought going in and, okay, if we put this information live, who is going to use it? What purpose are they using it for? What's the second order effect to their country as a whole, really, of us making that information available and in this format?
Yeah, I have a dream, to borrow the cliche. Yeah, and I think there are some registries that do this extremely well. New Zealand's not there yet, and the New Zealand Companies Registry will always be my favourite. It is, I describe it as small but imperfectly formed, and New Zealand has a few things going against it, by which I mean things like we have a very strong privacy regime in New Zealand, so we don't have identity cards such as the UK, such as Australia. And those jurisdictions that do, like Singapore and others, always look at us baffled when we say, well, no, we actually have to, there is some good faith stuff. We can't just automatically say this is a citizen because we have their number. Now, we'll talk shortly about the fact that these things are changing as they're changing in the UK. They've changed in Australia. We now have a digital ID regime sitting in Australia, a director ID regime, where a director has to have evidence of identity before, and they're allocated a unique identifier. New Zealand has signalled that is happening here. So it was the current government have confirmed in August last year that we will introduce a unique identifier for company directors and limited partners, which is a fantastic step. But when it comes to the dream, every data element that forms a company should be validated against a source. And you'll see that there's this massive trend in more developed and more modern registries where they are using technology to do exactly that, is to not accept. In the old world, when it was a register, someone came in and wrote things down, and there was abundance of trust everywhere. That doesn't make sense in a connected world where we have obvious sources of truth, single sources of truth for who a person is, what an address is, and where we can connect those things. And so you see fabulous examples like Norway, where they have mandated that, in fact, they've made an offence for a government agency to ask a citizen for a piece of information which has already been told to another agency of government. So they've created this sort of register of registers, this rule that says if we already know it, the onus is on government to use that for your benefit, rather than to keep laying it on. And I think there are, obviously I work for a tech company, so we love that sort of stuff because it just it makes sense, and B, it reduces that burden. If your address exists somewhere and we can legally ping it and say, yep, that address is the address that you've told us and it's valid. It's an upward spiral in terms of a modern expression of trust, is that if we can tick these boxes. And it also allows us, because all registries around the world, Australia, New Zealand, UK, Germany, have a limited resource, a human resource, in terms of how they address bad actors or bad behaviour on the register. And that's been the case from the creation of companies. They've been used for nefarious purposes. And so how do registries tackle that? If you can give them tools and allow them to surface the exceptions or the slightly more risky transactions, then the registry can target its expertise on those while having a high level of trust in the others. I mean, it's true everywhere that if a well-behaved entrepreneur, a well-behaved company director who owns one or more companies, who's always filed their annual return, who files their tax, they're not the target. It's the ones that come in and try and play. And how do you use tech, or how do you use the register to identify those, and what's the consequence?
Yeah, Again, something we've talked about quite a bit on this series is the extent to which verification is done at the point of registering a business, and should it be done? Where should that enforcement sit? And, in particular in the episode where we covered Companies House, we talked about some quite live stories and examples of exploits, if you like, being used for, quite clearly nefarious behavior, or maybe not proven in some cases, but that has the hallmarks of, a possible fraud or money laundering type activity. There have been examples of that in the press in New Zealand, a number of years ago. We always hesitate to call out the exploits on this show, but they have existed there. We talked about address validation then and director verification. What are some of the other ways that New Zealand specifically is looking to do this exception handling or flagging?
Yeah, and as I say, small but imperfectly formed. So New Zealand has had some big issues in the past. Thankfully, the company's registry can only do the things that its law allows it to do, and it has to be creative to prevent fraud where the law isn't as strong as it could be. So back in the day, we actually New Zealand was quite out of step because it allowed a single person company to be registered where that person was not resident in New Zealand. So it was actually perfectly legal for you to be, and I don't want to pick any jurisdiction and protect their evil, but let's say the evil empire of Palukistan could have a citizen register on the New Zealand Companies Office back in the day. And that was a huge problem because there was no, what I describe as regulatory reach. There was no way that we could, if that person then went on, as typically they did, to use their company for bad purposes. We had examples of them setting up retirement schemes in Florida, where they were trading on the good name of New Zealand. They were not resident in a nice country, and their company was doing evil things in Florida. So that created a real sense within the companies of us that we had to do something within the laws that we had. And so we applied a lot of thinking to triaging new companies and to finding ways where we could use the data elements that were coming in that we knew were more likely to be problematic. So what method of payment was being used? What was the origin of this company, both from an IP address and the description of where the person had said we're from Palukistan. We looked at whether this was a new person, whether this natural person was new on our register. Did we have them, whether a company of whether a director of lots of companies, or were they new? And then using this triage, we were able to slow down the incorporation process for those people that we were suspicious of. And we've always applied that position. And we said, okay, that's fine. You can be a director and you can form this company, but we're going to ask for more information. So there's a provision in the law that allows the registrar to check the veracity of any statement made. And we applied that hellishly to slow down bad behavior. The law has since been changed, I hasten to add, and now you have to be there has to be a minimum of one resident director, which is consistent with most jurisdictions. With an interesting twist, because New Zealand is always thinking globally, that the Act allows there to be a schedule of jurisdictions that are trusted by New Zealand, Australia being the first. So you can be a resident. Our residency requirement is that you can be a resident either of New Zealand or Australia. So we can have a sole director who is an Australian citizen, resident in Australia, because we have a mutual recognition and an exchange of regulatory reach with Australia and New Zealand. So if the Australian director behaves poorly with a New Zealand company, we ring our colleagues in Australia and they knock on the door and assist for us, and we do the same for them here. And it's the great thing about that is it's got the scope to expand to other jurisdictions, Singapore, wherever. Once we reach a sort of a threshold of trust with those jurisdictions, we could have a global network of resident directors, effectively.
Yeah, well, it's a great example of collaboration between two countries and two registries. And actually, one thing we haven't talked about on the show yet is some of the activities that exist to get some of these registries together. And we met at one of those. So the Corporate Registers Forum back in November of last year, lots of corporate registries in a room talking about how they can better collaborate and share best practice. So, it is happening, and obviously we hope it happens much quicker, but the more there is information exchange, I guess, and the more is collaboration on enforcement and some of that triaging we talked about, it's going to help to get on top of that challenge much, much quicker.
Yeah, no, I think, the Corporate Registers Forum is absolutely a great example of that. There's the International Association of Commercial Administrators in the United States and Canada, so that where those registers meet annually, the registry teams there share information, standardize stuff. We have the European Business Registers Association, which does the same thing for Europe, and there's a subset of people that go to all of those actually. And in my lifetime, I've seen huge shifts, tectonic shifts in the conversation, almost going from being isolationist to we know that our businesses are moving freely around these jurisdictions. How do we help? And some of it is shameless theft of good ideas and competition for who's the coolest registry, but the other is really practical standards-based stuff. And things like, business numbers, director IDs, beneficial ownership, of course, is the darling. It's been the darling for a couple of years now. It's been the theme for a couple of years for these registers to understand. And I think the great thing is, instead of everyone going off like they did in the old days and building their own thing, there is much more conversation when we start to build these new registers, and even at a legislative place, where they will involve organizations like Open Ownership and others to say, let's start with a standards-based approach. So if you're going to build one, understand that it's going to be consumed by other jurisdictions. And the more we can start from a standards-based, then the easier it becomes for businesses globally to know the rules. So it's the same rule here as it was in Australia, and it's the same rule here as it will be in this country. So that makes their life easier, but also to consume that information, to know that it's going to be the same wherever they get it from, and they can make sense of it. But a small segue there. We often look at certificates of incorporation. How do you know that what you're looking at from this jurisdiction is actually the certificate? Because it'll be in a different language. And you look at passports as a good example. That problem's been solved years ago. There's a standard language, a standard format. And so organizations like the European Business Registers Association have done really great work over the years in terms of mapping some of that stuff. And that's now being shared through these communities of interest or practice. And companies' offices internationally are looking at, well, these are the elements we need to have. These are how we flag them. So it becomes much easier for us to all pass information around.
Well, that's a great segue into probably the last topic we wanted to talk about, which was around beneficial ownership. So again, if I sit myself in the seat of someone working in financial crime and attempting to use this register for the purposes of verification, we take sort of 3 tests. So we've got a tick in the box for transparent, available information. We've got our first tick in the box so far in the series for there's some triaging, some anomaly detection going on of that information. There is some trust what's being filed. So third one then. So let's talk about beneficial ownership. If I want to verify the UBO of a business that's registered in New Zealand, how would I go about doing that at the moment?
Well, at the moment, you're going to have to, and I would look, I would say this always that, in the perfect world, the company's registry would be the single source that you would be able to trust. I think the reality is life's never as simple as that. And if there are other elements of information that anyone who wants to do business with a company are going to need to have, and they're going to use fine organizations like Kicker and others to because you need aggregated information. So New Zealand provide 23 different register types, and you can do quite a good search. You can search for the company and you can see whether it owes money under the Personal Property Securities Register. There's some you can do. You can know that they've done some checking to make sure that the directors aren't bankrupt because there's connections with the insolvency registers and so on. New Zealand has signalled a desire or an intent to implement a beneficial ownership register. It needs to do so to meet our FATF and AML obligations internationally. The previous government, under Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, announced that in March 2020 that we would have a beneficial ownership, 2022, a beneficial ownership register, that it would be a public register, which was interesting because the officials at the time had the advice was that it should be a closed register available only to law enforcement. The decision was made for a transparent register and the introduction of unique identifiers for directors, limited partners, and beneficial owners. A recent announcement in August last year, the new government has paused that. There's a big tranche of Companies Act modernisation being delivered, which is great, around identification of directors and so on, but they have stopped short of announcing the beneficial ownership register. Now, that's frustrating for a number of actors in the New Zealand, and it was criticised by Transparency International and Ministry of Justice and others, because we will need one, and Australia are ahead of us in that, and we never like to lose to Australia in anything. But I think it's a case of if not when. So at the moment, it's a case of looking at other sources and using third party providers to get some of that information. The NZBN is a good solid place to look. We have tied the New Zealand Companies Office to the tax office, so there's another level of certainty around some of the natural person. But until the unique identifier is locked in, a consumer would still have to rely on a higher level of diligence provided potentially by a third party until that register is available. And the other big, curveball, and New Zealand's not unique here in terms of our very active property market, is we have a lot of trusts. There's a lot of family trusts, and until there's a way in which you can peek in behind those, there's always going to be a bit of an issue there.
Well, yeah, like you said, I mean, it'd be interesting to see what the progress is on the beneficial ownership register, and it points once again a theme we've uncovered here, which is that political developments can impact, what information is available and how transparent the regime is. I mean, one thing I would just highlight, though, going back to what we talked about earlier, which is the information that is available at the moment, is, just how accessible and visible some of the shareholder data is, which is certainly not the case for the registries that we compared earlier. So in the UK, you're going to have to go digging for that stuff if you want to find out who owns a company. Maybe slightly more accessible in Australia, but hidden behind barrier of being quite expensive to buy that information. So, you log onto the company's office and you search for a New Zealand-based company, you will get a list of shareholders. And not only that, you will get a list of shareholders with addresses, which I've always found quite interesting, because if you're trying to uncover who the true owners are of a business and they resolve to another country, so they are residents of, Australia or wherever it might be, then you've got a kind of next step pointed out to you. It doesn't give you all of the information to tell you who the ultimate owners are, but it at least gives you that signpost in a way that many of the other registries don't.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, and so we'll tell you as well whether the company you're looking at has an ultimate owner, and so there's that flag that'll point to the fact that this company actually has a separate ultimate owner. And where the company is owned by another New Zealand company, there's that nesting effect. So you'll actually be able to click through without having to do another search. You can physically follow by clicking through that tree of ownership until, as sometimes happens, it is an offshore thing. In the case of an Australian one, you'll be able to click, if it's a New Zealand company owned by an Australian company, because of that mutual recognition and an MOU with ASIC, you'll actually be able to click and go through that way as well. So you'll actually be able to, because those two registers talk to each other and are connected, you can do that search. But the moment it goes beyond that, then you are probably best to ring I don't know, or someone similar.
Well, that's probably a good place to end, not just because of the praise for Kicker, but because it's broadly where we started, actually, which is that, if you work in the public sector, as you did for many years, you are at the will of politics and political change. There's not a huge amount you can do about that. But what you can do is focus on the problem statements, the users you've got. And again, that's another clear example there of the user in mind. What are people going to do with this information? Why are they querying it? And making it more accessible, if not, the full level of transparency we would like, at least thinking about how can we make it easier for the users of the registry to do the tasks they're required to do by law, I might add in the case of the AML Act.
Absolutely.
Justin, really good talking to you. I'm sure everybody listening will have appreciated your knowledge and passion about the subject. So I want to thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for the opportunity.
Wow, super interesting discussion there with Justin. And you can really hear his passion and expertise come through as well. A few reflections from me. So firstly, there are definitely areas where New Zealand excels in terms of data availability, which is particularly useful if you're using the registry to verify a business. In no particular order, I was pleasantly surprised to see shareholders listed with addresses, trading names, nested ownership between New Zealand and Australia, and in general, the good availability of APIs as well. As with every register, though, it does have its quirks. Justin already mentioned the lack of annual accounts, but also worth bearing in mind that while shareholder identification is good, there are actually no share classes or types on the registry, so slightly more difficult to ascertain voting rights or other shareholding-related rights or responsibilities. A shame to see no available UBO data as well, depending on your point of view, and interesting to see the role that politics has played yet again in influencing the landscape around this. We'll wait and see what happens over the coming months on that one. As always, if you still want to know more, you can find a link to Kicker's New Zealand Registry Guide in the podcast description, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks for our next episode.